front. Your next news update is at 7:30. Chicago's Morning Answer continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Following up on her speech in Selma over the weekend, Vice President Kamala Harris, in which Vice President Kamala Harris said, one breath after the next, Israel needs to eradicate Hamas and agree to an immediate ceasefire. Okay.
Speaking out of both sides of her mouth. How lovely.
Trying to appease different identitarian constituency groups in this country simultaneously. Probably, as is customary, will appease neither because unlike Kamala Harris, most people can see the oxymoronic statement for what it is. She followed that up with this tour de force on the Middle East.
You know, the president and I have been very clear that Israel has a right to defend itself, that we have got to make sure that innocent civilians aren't being killed, and that we've got to get these hostages out. And that is one of the highest priorities right now we have. And I'll tell you, the president has been an extraordinary leader in getting us to this point that we have this 6-week deal. And so Hamas needs to do its thing, as I talked about yesterday in Selma.
Hamas needs to do its thing. What is its thing? What is Hamas's thing?
I don't know. What is it, Dan?
I mean, I suppose a charitable reading would be to do its thing, like to agree to the ceasefire, but doesn't seem like that's happening because they won't provide information on the hostages that's been demanded by Israel. Those hostages that Kamala Harris cares so much about.
Yeah, what about those American hostages? What are their names? Say their names.
Judith Butler is the pronoun philosopher. She's a radical gender ideologue and third-wave feminist of some renown in leftist academic circles who spent her critical years, and that is a double entendre, critical, refining critical theory at Berkeley. And here's what she said at a recent talk about the situation in Gaza and how we should conceive of it. You know, as we should conceive of people entering this country illegally as newcomers, so we should conceive of October 7th as armed resistance to an oppressor. And it is only when we properly start from that conception that we can have an honest debate on the topic.
We can have different views about Hamas as a political party. We can have different views about armed resistance. But I think it is more honest and historically correct to say that the uprising of October 7th was an act of armed resistance. It is not a terrorist attack, and it's not an anti-Semitic attack. It was an attack against Israelis, and, you know, I did not like that attack. I have gone public with this. I have gotten in trouble for saying it was, for me, anguishing. It was anguishing. It was terrible. However, I would be very foolish if I then decided that the only violence in the scene was the violence done to Israeli people. The violence done to Palestinians has been happening for decades. This was an uprising that comes from a state of subjugation and against a violent state apparatus. Okay, let us be clear. Now, you can be for or against armed resistance, you can be for or against Hamas, but let us at least call it armed resistance, and then we can have a debate about whether we think it's right or whether they did the right thing, whether a different strategy. But the problem is, if you call it armed resistance, you are immediately thought to be in favor of armed resistance and in favor of that armed resistance and that tactic. It's like, well, actually, maybe not that tactic, and we can discuss armed resistance. You know, it is an open debate.
Yeah, no, we can be for or against Hamas. I'd love to hear the pro argument. I'm sure Judith Butler could offer one. I noticed, I was surprised, where were the Jewish students shouting Judith Butler down and screaming while she was talking and pounding on the windows and threatening the lives of those in attendance who were applauding? Gosh, they weren't there.
Yeah, because
That's
they have
so much
decorum.
so much different than was the situation at Judith Butler's former employer, Cal Berkeley, the other day, wasn't it? Yeah, I hope paying attention. I mean, you know, these are the leading intellectual and political lights of the left, some of them. So I hope Jewish Americans and others who consider themselves men and women of the left, but are not pro-Hamas, are taking this all in, taking it all in when Jamal Bowman, the fire starter or fire alarm starter at least, and Rashida Tlaib are posting selfies with people in the background, free Palestine and all this other stuff, basically just handles for the same philosophy that Judith Butler just offered. Interesting times where the left's coalition seems to be fraying. We mentioned the polling over the weekend. The New York Times Siena poll finds Trump up. Not just up from previous numbers, not just getting a bigger percentage of the Latino vote, for example, but up 46-40 on Joe Biden among the Latino vote.
Yeah.
At 23% with the black vote, which would probably be the biggest percentage of the black vote a Republican presidential candidate got since the Southern Strategy. For more on all this, please be joined by Noah Rothman, senior writer at National Review, author of The Rise of the New Puritans, Fighting Back Against Progressives' War on Fun. Noah, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So the ever middling position of the Biden administration on Israel and Hamas, Gaza.
Right.
Commentary on this.
I wasn't sure what the question was there.
Well, I mean, it's sort of
what
like
is this?
It's sort of like Go. I mean, right? It's the only thing that's interesting about it are sort of the domestic political calculations, because I suspect, we talked about this a bit earlier in the week with Stephen Bucci, that what Kamala Harris and Biden are saying is trying to middle with Palestinian voters and Muslim voters that are aligned with the ceasefire position, while also appeasing Jewish voters that they don't really expect Bibi to pay much attention to what they're demanding of him.
Well, I'll tell you the truth. I don't really quite understand where the administration is coming from with its efforts to split this baby. It's exemplified in Judith Butler's comments.
Yeah.
That the anti-Israel side of this equation, small as it is, as measured in polls, is very loud, very vocal, and very insecure. Just by virtue of what she's saying there, she doesn't really have a firm moral and ethical grounding in her own position, because she's saying, listen, we can talk about this sort of thing, but first you have to accept my premise. Don't reject my premise, which is itself extraordinarily dubious, full of holes, and founded on based on a foundation of sand. We have to start from a position that accepts what my priors are, at which point we can debate. That's not the mark of somebody who's deeply invested in their position. That's somebody who's scared of their own conclusions and doesn't fully trust them and expects you to grant them quite a lot of leeway before we even begin the terms of debate. And those are the people to whom this administration seems desperate to cater, even after they have evidence in the form of at least Michigan's protest vote, which demonstrated, in terms of not raw votes, but the total participation of that protest vote in the election, that it amounts to about 13%, which is something you can kind of take for granted, especially when the other side of the equation is really leery about how you've approached the Israel's defensive war, and supports Israel's defensive war. A lot of this has to do with the distribution of aid, and the administration is trying to build up this premise, Judith Butler's premise, in the absence of evidence, even though it's contrary to what they need to do. Kamala Harris is very mad about the distribution of aid in the Gaza Strip. Israel negotiated the terms with Egypt to allow aid into the Gaza Strip as early as October 18th. Aid began flowing on October 21st. In the middle of December, they opened up crossings directly from Israel territory into Gaza and have been administering aid despite, quote, threats of sniper fire, anti-tank missiles, and other threats to civilian life. As of March 4th, when I last wrote about this, 14,000 trucks have delivered 267,000 tons of humanitarian aid to Gaza, all of which is being inspected by the IDF and distributed by the IDF at sometimes dangerous cost to IDF soldiers. We had this event last week, two events that have been conflated by Israel's critics, but both of which devolved into really chaotic scenes where mobs attacked these trucks. Some of the trucks trying to escape ran over some of these civilians, and at a separate occasion, mobs descended on IDF soldiers. The IDF got scared. They fired warning shots over their heads. When that didn't work, they fired at their extremities and caused some casualties. Well, the only reason why we know this is because Israel tells us this. They release the footage. They conduct the investigations, and they release the information. That's why we understand they're an honest broker, because they're telling us when they do things that don't make them look great. The administration wants to erase all this and paint Israel as the bad guy, even though it's contrary to their mission. Their mission is to see Israel win this war with all due alacrity. That's what they need, and yet they're acting at cross purposes.
Well, I was under the impression that Hamas was stealing the aid that was coming in, and therefore the need to do that airdrop that they did on Saturday when 36,000 meals came floating down via these beautiful parachutes and people were running to get the food. So is that a
some of them are. Narrative? I mean, some of them are, according to John Kirby. John Kirby's the spokesperson for the National Security Council. Said, I mean, Hamas is going to steal some of this stuff, but nevertheless, got to do it. And that's the administration's position. It's fine that there's going to be certain inventory loss here to Hamas soldiers, which will keep them on the battlefield, keep them fed, armed, and engaged in the fight. And that's a risk this administration is willing to take. Fine. And at least they're being honest about it. But it's nevertheless contradictory to what their purpose is, which is to see Israel win this war as fast as possible. It's a terrible war. Nobody should think that the situation on the ground in Gaza is pleasant. It's not. All of it, however, is the responsibility of Hamas, which brought this war upon their people.
When you say that the administration needs to see Israel win this war as soon as possible, what do you mean? To what end?
The administration has invested American capital in the form of arms and support for Israel, and American prestige in the notion that Israel's right to self-defense is righteous, justified. And because this is such a political conundrum for him domestically, the sooner Israel wins this war, the better, just to get it off the table or just to reduce the heat and the tension around it, especially ahead of Election Day. So the administration can't really have it both ways. They've already pushed their chips in for Israel. So any sort of backtracking there just contradicts their stated position and undermines their objective, which is to see Israel win quickly and cleanly as possible.
Well, then the 6-week ceasefire that was proposed sort of extends that, doesn't it? And I mean, I know the lure of hostages is an attractive one, understandably so. You want to see the hostages freed, but the argument would go, look, if you don't deal a crushing blow to Hamas, then you never get whatever's left of them to the table to establish something that Israel and the West can live with in terms of Gaza's governance, right?
Yeah, so the argument in favor of the Biden administration's position is that it's been doing kind of a kabuki two-step, that every time it criticizes Israel or seems to criticize Israel publicly, it's really just stating what Israel's going to do or about to do. So it's saying, you need to ramp down combat operations in southern Gaza. This is too horrible. Well, Israel was going to ramp down and has ramped down combat operations in southern Gaza. And then they say, we need this ceasefire, and Israel has to agree to it immediately. And they do, because they always were going to. And then it puts the onus on Gaza, or Hamas, rather. That I can see the contours of that argument, but it's betrayed a little bit by the reporting that we get from what the administration is telling Israeli officials behind the scenes, which reflect real distaste and displeasure with the conduct of its military operations in southern Gaza. So I'm not 100% sold on that, but that is the argument that is being made. Nevertheless, even if it was true, and again, I'm not sure it's true, but even if it were true, it doesn't demonstrate that the administration is foursquare behind its own objective here, which is, again, the speedy decimation of Hamas, the neutralization of Hamas as a threat to Israeli sovereignty.
With respect to the Super Tuesday results in, as anticipated, although I'm not sure, maybe Nikki Haley should be making her withdrawal speech in Montpelier rather than Charleston, someplace she actually won. But the prospect for Biden on the other side, particularly with this week's polling numbers, you still see scuttlebutt out there about the DNC, if having to intercede if Biden's performance on the trail continues to leave people wanting in terms of confidence in his mental acuity, that they would free up the electors and we'll have a convention fight. And this is a way to get a new nominee that's not named Kamala. I mean, what do you sense as sort of that potential last-ditch prospect for the DNC to make a replacement?
It just seems like an Aaron Sorkin fantasy to me.
Yeah, I agree. Perfect.
I mean, it's possible, I guess, but I mean, the number of moving parts there and the amount of lubricant you would have to apply to them in order to get them to break off their attachment to an incumbent. And the Democratic Party has institutional memory about what happens when you abandon an incumbent. None of it's good. That's why both the parties are so beholden to their incumbents. But we have got some clues from Super Tuesday on the Democratic side, uncompetitive though it was, about where the Democratic Party is in relation to Joe Biden and in relation to Barack Obama, because Barack Obama drew a protest vote too in 2012, the last time we had a comparable set of circumstances like these. And Joe Biden pretty much, by and large, outperforms Barack Obama among a certain set of voters, which are what we would understand to be, for lack of a better term, normie voters. They're not hyper-progressive. They're not on the fringes of their coalition. They're persuadable by the other side. By contrast, Barack Obama was adored by that portion of his base, but the other, the gettable portion for Republicans or independents, more swingy voters, they weren't necessarily sold on him by this point in 2012.
Well,
Democrats, just briefly, the conclusion is Democrats are more comfortable with Joe Biden than you would be led to believe by A, the commentary publicly, and B, in the polling. So there's just very little impetus to throw Joe Biden under the boat, unless there's some sort of a really big event that makes Democrats say not only are they discomfited with Joe Biden, but they won't vote for him, which we haven't seen really in polling, then I don't think anything's going to change.
So what do you make of these numbers? Because Axios, they just came in a few minutes ago. North Carolina, 88,000 voted no preference. Massachusetts, 54,000. Minnesota, 45,000. Colorado, 43,000. Alabama, 11. Tennessee, 10. And then you have, Michigan had 100,000, 103,000.
Yes, these are
primary voters.
These are big numbers.
Right. I mean, it's not. I mean, don't you think they're concerned?
Well, as a share of the vote, though, in Alabama, Joe Biden got 90% of the vote. Now Arkansas, he got 90% of the vote. In Massachusetts, he got 82% of the vote. North Carolina, 88% of the vote, and so on. Tennessee, 93. Right. Texas, 86. So on, and so forth. So as raw vote totals, which is what the protest vote emphasizes, that the raw vote is really big. And if you look at it, for example, say Michigan, the protest vote, they said a very low bar for themselves. They said, we only want to get 10,000 votes, because that's roughly the margin by which Hillary Clinton lost Michigan in 2016 to Donald Trump, and it would send a message. And if you combine the uncommitted vote with the votes for candidates like Marianne Williams and Dean Phillips, the protest candidates, it gets to about 145,000. And Joe Biden only won Michigan by 154,000 in 2020. So big numbers. If they all materialize in November, it could really threaten Joe Biden's hold over the state. But again, if you zoom out and you look at it from the percentage of the actual electorate, because turnout was humongous, and the vast, vast, vast majority of that turnout turned out to ratify Joe Biden's position at the head of the Democratic Party. And so you can pick and choose your narrative here if you want, but the narrative that's going to prevail is the fact that in 2012, Barack Obama got 11% protest vote, and in 2024, Joe Biden got 13% protest vote, and it's negligible as a difference.
Noah Rothman, senior writer at National Review, author of The Rise of the New Puritans, Fighting Back Against Progressives' War on Fun. Noah, thanks as always.
Thank you.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
Listen up. Do you or a family member or friend have an outstanding student loan and don't know where to turn or how much you're required to pay? The rules around student loan forgiveness have never been as complex as they are right now. The wrong decision could cost you and your family tens of thousands of dollars in unnecessary loan payments. Attorney Ray Kaplan at Kaplan Law Firm is here to help you make the right decision. And they recently saved a radio listener over $180,000.